We don't need to teach children how knowledge. We need to teach them how to use knowledge, never recognizing that you can't use something you don't have. It was this mixture of this romanticist view of a child. Um, and you don't want to really impose anything on them. And there's this naturalistic philosophy behind it that, children, as long as you let them be.
Today, my guest is Martin Cothran. Martin is an author, a teacher, and a leader within the classical education renewal movement. He's the editor of The Classical Teacher, which I get at least semesterly, if not quarterly. I know we're on y'all's mailing list. He's the author of multiple logic and rhetoric textbooks with Memoria Press, and he's a regular on Memoria Press's podcast, Classical, etc. Martin, welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon.
Good to be here.
I have to tell you, I am so grateful to you for your graciousness. It's not every day that I turn around at a conference and meet somebody whose textbooks I used to have on my shelf, and now I'm like, oh wait, I've looked at Martin Cothran's logic books for years, and lo and behold, he's a real live human being, and he's willing to come on the show. That's just amazing. So thank you so much for being here with us today.
Good to be here.
Martin, let's start with a little bit of your story. How did you get into classical education?
Well, Cheryl Lowe and I, who co-founded Highlands Latin School, where I'm sitting right now, and Memoria Press, our publishing company, we met because of a sweeping education reform that was done here in the early 1990s. Every bad progressivist idea that had ever been invented, and they were going to implement it all. And so we didn't know a lot about the history of education and what precisely was wrong with this. Cheryl knew more than I did. And we just started reading, and then we started reading sort of the history of modern education and realizing what this was, that it had already been tried 3 or 4 times and failed. And that, and just philosophically where it came from. This sort of progressivist romanticism. And so we launched a sort of a rebellion against this. And we were doing lobbying work at the state capitol to try to change this thing. And it was one of the most effective oppositions to anything the state had ever seen. It was a veritable parent rebellion. I mean, I would barnstorm the state. I'd arrive at some little courthouse in some rural area, and there'd be 200 angry parents there because their kids weren't learning to read or add, subtract, multiply, and divide. And we actually, I was in public policy at that time, but it was the first time I'd been involved in the education issue. So we ended up winning. We converted all of the public school groups, other than the teachers' unions, to our side because they had other interests that were opposed to this. And ultimately, it became the big issue in the 1997 gubernatorial election here. Reform the reforms, and then ultimately it was driven out. But it's sort of like the blob. You throw things at it and it just becomes stronger. So they just came back, and it just came back in some other form. And so we decided to found a private school and a private publishing company and do this right. And in that whole process, we had started to read about classical education. And so I founded a school in 1992 that's still in operation. And then Cheryl and I founded Highlands Latin School up here in Louisville, Kentucky. And we've been running that ever since.
That's kind of amazing. I think there's so many pieces I want to follow up on, but I'm just going to confine myself to a couple of them. I want to go back to what you said, like every bad progressive idea was kind of wrapped up in that bill. It seems to me that there's really, and I've only been paying attention to the educational landscape for really intentionally for about 15 years or so. I've been out of college, and it seems like it's really the same set of bad ideas that keep coming around. There's some idea of like, well, what if we could make it all easier? What if we could make education more fun? And what if we could somehow get rid of the actual content that makes up a traditional Western education. It seems like all of the progressive ideas are kind of aiming at that in some way. Is that what you see, or did you see some different set of ideas wrapped up in that bill and continuing to cycle through?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was this mixture of this romanticist view of a child, um, and you don't want to really impose anything on them. And there's this naturalistic philosophy behind it that children, as long as you let them be, they so all of these things we in the Western world have done with children for many years, which is make them learn letter sound correspondences and basic arithmetical facts. That is viewed as being authoritarian, and so that's a large part of it. But we went back and we read the great histories of education in this country. Lawrence Kremen, who is the dean of education scholars at Columbia University, strangely, which was one of the headquarters of the nonsense. He was not. It was hard to tell his educational philosophy, but he appeared to be a traditionalist in some form. And he wrote a book called The Transformation of the School. That was one of the key books that we read. And his student was Diane Ravitch, also at Columbia University. And she wrote, I don't totally agree with her on some things, but she wrote some very good books. Left Back, I think, was one of them, about taking the mantle of Lawrence Kremen and becoming sort of the dean of education scholars, and criticizing some of the stuff that was going on in schools. It was unrealistic. It never worked. It's been tried several times, and so it is a matter of educating ourselves on what education really was, and through that process, of course, we discovered classical education.
I think it's really interesting you mentioned Columbia University, because I was just reading last night. There was an article out from the Free Press yesterday from I still have the author's name pulled up, Dan Lerman, who's a professor of cognitive science at Columbia University Teachers College. He wrote a long form article all about the collapse of teaching facts in public education. And I read that, and I mean, he's right. And I'm sure you've run into articles that do this, where someone is kind of new to a conversation and he's sort of reporting it as if like this is all breathtaking. And I'm reading this kind of like, well, gee, Dan, welcome to the fight. This is what all of us in the classical ed world have been saying for decades. We actually need knowledge, and we need a content-rich curriculum, or none of the positive effects of education actually happen.
Yeah, and this is, their rhetoric does betray this. I mean, we don't need to teach children how knowledge. We need to teach them how to use knowledge, never recognizing that you can't use something you don't have, right? And it's also, and this is the refreshing thing about classical education, is one of really one of the main purposes of classical education was to pass on our civilization, right? We've brought ourselves to a point culturally, or we had, where we had advanced ourselves to an incredible degree, and there was a set of literature that we used to do that, stories, historical, literary, as well as the sciences, and we've made all this great progress, and then we just want to throw that all overboard in the interest of psychology, which is what really is behind a lot of this, is this strange educational psychology that they have. Because what happened in this country is, in the 1920s, you had the first round of reforms that were really inspired by Dewey, and they went into the schools and they de-emphasized knowledge. They emphasized how children learn. We're going to learn how children learn, and we're going to teach according to that. That was not the classical way of thinking about this. Classical way of thinking about it, there's stuff we want you to learn, and the way we're going to teach it is dictated by the subject, not by not your psychology. So that was in the early 20s. It was very unpopular, got run out of schools. It comes back in the late 40s with a vocational emphasis added to that, not just the psychological state of the child, or also Dewey wanted to use schools to change the culture. He had a political goal there. So in comes William Herd Kilpatrick, who's emphasizing vocationalism, and he doesn't want to change the culture. He wants to fit children to the culture, and most specifically the economy. That's late 40s. So all through the 50s, there was this big, huge educational debate that everyone's forgotten about in this country, where the second round of progressivism comes in again in the late 60s and early 70s with the new math and open classrooms, gets run out of schools again. But like Diane Rabbit said, it goes a little further every time. There's this ratchet effect that goes further and further to the educational left. And then lo and behold, late 80s, early 90s, outcomes-based education, progressivism with high stakes testing. And then in 2010, out comes Common Core, which was just a new iteration of this. So we've been victimized, and we're victimized every 25 years with an ideology of education that doesn't work. It always fails.
Hey, when you were the idea of education as having this purpose of transmitting culture reminds me of Mortimer Adler and a lot of his work. He would use the Greek term paideia to refer to that, and talked a lot about the fact that one of the core tenets of education is this sense of the teacher as one who understands the culture and is seeking to transmit that culture. He would call that enculturation, but he looked at the Greeks as they had this kind of set method of whereby they weren't really trying to innovate. It's not as if you were trying to do something new every generation and always change it up, but instead there was sort of a standing pattern of paideia that father and son would have both gone through that was preparatory for, really was thought to be preparatory for what a free man needed to exercise his freedom and to do it well. Now that sense of paideia changes over time, but I think it sort of captures a lot of what we've lost in a way. That there is, I think there's particularly when talking about public education, there's no longer a sense of common knowledge that each generation has encountered and contemplated and found valuable. And that really seems to me to be a theft from the current generation. There's something they're owed. It is their intellectual inheritance, but they can't access it without the present generation actively passing it to them.
Right. Yeah, that's very true. And that's why it's so so tragic that every one of these reforms is trying to get away from that. And, it seems like in terms of the way they change the curriculum, what they almost always do is they demote literature and history. And today, a lot of this is done because we're trying to use tests to improve our schools, right? Rather than find out what children know. And when they do this, I mean, E.D. Hirsch, another great commentator on this issue, E.D. Hirsch points out that 47% of the time taken away from school subjects in order to do test prep is taken from history and literature, right? It's the humanities that always get the short stick here. And these are the most important subjects in a classical curriculum because those are the ones that transmit our ideals and values. We need, and that was the way classical education did it. It didn't ask us to memorize them and this sort of thing. We don't get a values curriculum, although that's what many have tried to do. We get that through our literature and our history. We see it embodied in the great actions and the very bad actions of historical figures so that we learn how to admire the good and how to disdain the evil. And we do it in a story, either looking at ideals as they're performed on the outside through history, or on the inside in literature, because we're in the heads of the characters. We're learning how a good person thinks. And that's how we learn how to think like a good person, right? And from the outside in history, we see the actions of great figures, and we are inspired by that, and we want to do that ourselves.
I want to camp out on this point for a moment because I think it's really important, and it's one that I'll freely confess I feel sympathy for, and I struggle always to hold that particular line. Because even in classical education circles, it's often the case that there is either we've just left math and science people out of professional development and out of the conference circuit to some degree, or there's sort of some sense of like, well, we too ought to be as good at math and science as the greats of the 17th century were. We ought to have our Eulers and our Newtons and so on. But you made the case a moment ago that actually the most important subjects in the curriculum are the humanities. Expand on that a bit. Why would you say those are the most important? Why are they more significant than the quantitative arts, than the things that are going to lead towards STEM careers and so on?
Well, math and science tell us how to manipulate the world, right? Physically. And they give us, and we have an increasing amount of power over ourselves, over other people, over the world, because of what math and science have conferred upon us in that regard. The problem is we need to know what kind of power we should and shouldn't exercise. And math and science isn't going to tell you that. You have to learn that through subjects that that are moral in nature, right? We can make ourselves very technologically powerful, and there's good aspects to that, but there's also really bad aspects to that. We see it all the time, from cloning to whatever. And if we're not able to think morally about those things, then we've not only not done ourselves any good, we've made things worse, right? But the other aspect of your question was, STEM careers and all this. Well, right now, I mean, this is the news as of the last couple of weeks, is that we have all of these students that we've taught coding, because coding was the job of the future, right? Well, what are they discovering now as they go out, they graduate, they go out into the world?
Vibe coding is the new thing.
AI is doing coding. Sorry, fella. We don't have any jobs for you. So coders can't find jobs. Now, I happen to be in a family with a lot of technological expertise. My oldest son and my second oldest son are both principal software developers, one for a top 40 company and another for the U.S. Soccer Federation. He was a soccer player. And they can do what they can do because they were classically educated, right? My oldest son was classically educated, and he was a philosophy major in school. Never took a computer science course. Never, I don't think, even took a math course. And he is a very high level computer software guy. And in fact, he's kind of a closure guru, apparently, in that world. Writes a lot of scholarly articles about this. And then my second son, he was a exercise physiology major with a philosophy minor. And he too is very good web guy, all that stuff. And he had one computer science course. They succeeded in this, and this is very common. They succeeded because they knew how to think, right? Because you can even teach a computer language, and I mean, when I was going to school, we were studying Pascal and Fortran. Okay, those were obsolete by the time we graduated. Right. So you can't, the training that we call STEM training, even the stuff that you get in college is behind the times. That's why there's a lot of these coding boot camps, is because you have guys come in who are cutting edge. They're people who are in the industry and they know what's going on now. Whereas in the colleges and universities, it's constant criticism. They're behind the times. You're learning stuff that's old. And so you're not getting the latest thing. And there's a lot more, arguments to this, but I just think that and there's a book, and I noticed that it's gotten around since I started talking about it, Range by David Goldstein, called Range, How Generalists Triumphed in a Specialized World. And his whole argument in there is, look at the education of the pioneers of the tech. Mark Zuckerberg, who knew how to read and write Latin, how to read and write Greek, and knew how to read Hebrew before he went to college.
What?
Before he went to college.
I had no idea.
He was classically educated. And none of all those guys were dropouts, practically. So they didn't have the kind of technical education that that we have available today, and probably wouldn't have been helped by it. They were pioneers. They were thinking for themselves. They knew how to think before going in. Even Stephen Jobs, was not a technical. The technical aspect of what he did was not the important thing. It was his imagination, because he could imagine what people would buy if he could make it, and he knew through his own imagination that people would buy that sort of thing, right? And then he made his products beautiful. He always talks about his calligraphy class. When you ask him about how he, became his calligraphy class, he understood beauty. And it got me, I was one of the victims of it, because the first iMacs come out, and that's a beautiful machine. I got to have that. I bought one, and it worked for about 3 months. And by then, the guy who sold it to me was out of business, and I could never get it repaired. So, yeah, but it's you do not know what the future is going to bring. So the best kind of education that you can get is a broad, general, classical education.
I love that answer. And I asked not because I in any way disagree. I was hoping that you would have a very strong response on that. You definitely delivered, Martin. I mean, I think it's one of the things that I run into in my work at Thales College. I often run into parents who want to know, well, okay, so y'all offer a BA in business and liberal arts. What's my kid going to do with that? And I tend to try to go back to that generalist foundation. I mean, we have the broadest foundation and practical skills we can come up with is this business, entrepreneurial business degree. But we want to pair that with a BA in liberal arts because we need to be well-versed in the timeless wisdom of the Western tradition. And that I think that's especially in a moment like today, and this is nothing new. We're just seeing it so accelerated now. AI didn't really change any existential positions, I think, of modern man. It started moving us all so fast that we're like, whoa, what is going on? Mm-hmm. Where did all the paralegal jobs go? They're gone. And it just seems to be creeping everywhere. It's been a big topic of discussion around the college this semester about entry-level jobs and how those are the places that for so many fields, those were the places where you would get your first 2-3 years of training in an industry and you move up. But now it's far more cost effective to oversee 2 or 3 AI engines doing the work of 15 entry-level people. But like, what's going to happen in 10 years? And my argument to students, at least, has been that like, you just need to stop thinking that you are somehow preparing for a specific job. It's most likely the case that the job you're going to work doesn't exist yet. And even so, which pushes us right back to the original core of like what education is for. Education is not for job preparation or job training. It's for forming the human person. It's for exercising all of our potential into reality. It's for becoming who you are becoming, to wax Kierkegaardian for just a moment. And if you do that right, you will always have options and opportunities, but you can't predict what form those are going to take.
That's exactly right. And, when I was in school, it was changing, but it was changing slowly. Now it's changing very quickly. So yeah, the point of your education shouldn't be a good job. It should be a good life. Now, obviously, a good job is part of that, but you want to be versatile. This is what is needed now. David Epstein, in his book Range, he says, like Mark Zuckerberg says, this industry is changing every 10 minutes. The more change there is in something, the more you need to be a generalist because you cannot predict what's going to happen.
Wow. Well, let's jump to a different subject. I would feel remiss if I didn't ask you about the story behind your logic textbooks, as I know you do a lot of things, and the traditional logic 1 and 2 textbooks are years ago now, but they're still in print as far as I can tell. But I know those as a project, those are several years back in your career. But they are the thing that I know most of your work. So take us back to why did you feel a need to write a logic curriculum, and what went into that project, and how has it gone since then?
Yeah. Well, when Cheryl and I decided, threw up our hands on the public schools in our state and founded our own school and publishing company, she already had written her Latina Christiana program, which was selling in the thousands word of mouth. And so that was our first product. And then we wanted to have something for each aspect of the classical trivium. And so we needed a logic program and we needed a rhetoric program. So my background was in philosophy. I had studied modern logic under one of Willard Van Orman Quine's students. Quine was the sort of logic god of the 20th century, the Harvard logic professor. And my professor was one of his students. And so we learned that modern system. But as I started to look into it more, I realized that wasn't the only system. There was this traditional logic system, which was not based on a lot of modern philosophical assumptions. It was based on old Aristotelian assumptions. And so I started to investigate it and realized there was all of these old manuals that they survived longest in Catholic schools, but they were used even in Protestant and public schools. I'm trying to think of the name of the gentleman who wrote the great Protestant figures, and I forget his name anyway. He did one that was a traditional logic, because that's all they had at that time. Mm-hmm. Modern logic doesn't even come around to the early part of the 20th century. Modern logic is very mathematical. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's not actually the way we reason as human beings in real life, right? We reason conceptually, not mechanistically, right? So the logic of concepts is the old Aristotelian traditional system. And so I just poured through all those old manuals that were used in the 19th century, early 20th century, up until the 50s or 60s, and just took the best of the best and simplified it down, made it as teachable as I could, and I put it into those books. And they've been quite successful. It's probably the most widely used logic text on the market now. And they pulled me in the other day to make some changes to some examples and stuff. So we're always kind of looking at it and listening to people to tweak it here and there. But it's the complete Aristotelian system, all the way up to the dilemma and the counter dilemma, which are these beautiful argument forms that are just so cool. There's great historical examples of these being used in history and in philosophy. So we just were trying to put together, a full selection of trivium products. And of course, I also did our rhetoric program, which is just a study. Mine is just a study of Aristotle's book, The Rhetoric. So it's all, based on Aristotelian principles, which were then taken by the church and used all the way up until the 20th century. So they've been very successful. I get in, I teach it every now and then just to refamiliarize myself with my own book. There's that great story about the Greek professor who got some disease which affected his brain, and so one part of his brain was severely affected, and unfortunately, it was the part of his brain that knew his Greek. And so he had to relearn his Greek. He's at Dallas Theological Seminary to this day, and he had to relearn his Greek. And you know where he learned it? From his own book. Yeah, it's an amazing story. That's what I have to do every now and then, is go back and learn my logic from my own book.
Oh, that's amazing. I mean, I think it's. I would imagine. I don't know if this is the case, but I would imagine that's something of a humbling experience too, because I know I have. I've gone back to. I've been writing different articles for publication since about 2015, and now 10 years into that, I've now gone back to some early ones, and I'm just kind of groaning at the fact that I put this terrible paragraph out into the world. And there's others that I look at, I'm like, dang, that was pretty good. I like that one, and it's. But to your point about the value of logic, particularly on the Protestant side, and I'm gonna pull from a Catholic example for this, but I taught Peter Kraef's Socratic logic textbook for 3 years, and there was I just remember getting to there's a chapter where he introduces epikairemas and sorites and 2 or 3 other it was the more like advanced argumentative structure chapter, I think is the way he set that up. But he pulled from the letters of the Apostle Paul to illustrate these. And I had never thought of Paul as being this particularly logical author until I'm sitting there. I never studied formal logic until my principal asked me to teach this class. And I figured, well, I have the skill of reading a textbook. I can read this one chapter ahead of the kids and I will figure it out. By the end of the year, I had a far deeper appreciation for Paul's logical thought. And then he himself must have been deeply trained in Aristotelian logic, because he's in hindsight now, when I go back to the book of Romans, I mean, he's working syllogistically and he's building his case. And then you can see the same structure throughout the rest of the Pauline letters, where all of his application points are derived from the theological reasoning that is set up in these Aristotelian forms in the first half of his letters.
Oh, yeah. If you're familiar with traditional logic and you go back and read the epistles, it's very clear that he was schooled in this, because they are literally textbook examples. And in fact, they're in my textbook. They're textbook examples of this. They're just as clear. Somebody doesn't do that accidentally. You have to be taught that. And particularly the complex argument forms like the epikyrema you were talking about. Paul is a very interesting figure to me, because he clearly, he's a Jew, he's a converted Christian, and he was clearly classically educated. And that's why that scene there at the Areopagus to me is just such a powerful scene, because it's Athens versus Jerusalem, but in a sense, Paul is bringing Athens and Jerusalem together in himself. This is the greatest evangelist we've ever had, and he was classically trained.
No. But he had his ability, his knowledge of the Greek poets enabled him to be able to say, but not to pick a fight that he didn't want to pick, because he obviously could pick theological fights when he wanted to, but he didn't want to get into the monotheism versus polytheism fight. That's a distraction. Or just the genius to be able to say, I see you have a statue to an unnamed God. Let me tell you who it is you're worshiping. I will declare to you his name and go from there. I mean, and even work in different references to their poetry is just astounding.
Oh, it is. It is. He's a very impressive figure, and he's more impressive when you get the classical education so that you can see it in him.
Yeah, and it's one of the pieces I love about the classical education movement is that the deeper you go into the tradition, the more suddenly you have in common with these great figures of the past. I mean, it's not just like, oh, Paul and I are separated by 2,000 years and we're of different ethnicities and different cultures. All of that's true, but at the same time, he too was well versed in Old Testament. He was well versed in Old Testament Judaism. He knew his Old Testament. He too met Jesus, and he too had to wrestle with how exactly do Athens and Jerusalem relate together under the current subjugation of Rome. And those questions haven't left. They're still key questions of the Western tradition.
That's right. And in a sense, we're like that Greek professor. We've forgotten as Westerners, we've forgotten all this knowledge, so we have to go back to our own books to learn it.
Well, we've both been using the term classical and classical education, and I've dropped the renewal movement idea in a couple times. I'm always fascinated by how people define this thing that we're all coming at from slightly adjacent angles. How would you define classical education, Martin?
Well, I think, I take my cue from Homer in this regard, because there's this scene where Phoenix, who's Achilles' teacher, says to him, at one of Achilles' many crisis moments, he says, your father commanded me to teach you how to speak and what to do. And if you can convert speaking into thinking, because it's just the expression of thought, what you have there is how to think and what to do. There's sort of an epistemological emphasis, an emphasis on knowledge. And there's also a moral emphasis on what to do, what you should do, right? And what we've done in modern times is to invert that. Instead of how to think and what to do, we're now taught what to think and how to do. Ideology and then vocationalism, the prevalence of these in our schools. So I sort of define it. There's 12 different ways you can define it very well, but one of the ways I talk about it is to say there's a cultural definition a broader cultural definition, and then a more specific individual definition. And so the cultural definition is simply passing on Western civilization. That was the point of what we did every generation, is to pass it on. And secondly, to form better human beings, right? That there's a certain kind of ideal human being that you can glean from not only the works of the Greeks and the Romans, but obviously the works of the great Christian authors who took that tradition into themselves and tried to perfect it in light of what they knew about what God had revealed. And so we have this ideal human being, and we see it, particularly as Christians, mostly in Christ himself. Imitate Christ. And we can imitate the people who have imitated Christ throughout history, right? So that's a twofold definition. I would passing on our culture and developing the souls of our students.
Love that. It seems, I mean, it fits with all the other definitions I've heard. I mean, I think usually, and I think you hit both sides. Like, in order to pass on Western Civ, we are talking about a clearly definable body of knowledge and a set of ideas and convictions that we hope students reach.
Yeah.
And yet there's also a virtue side.
Yeah. And if we put legs on it, then what we get, and again, I'm a simplifier, right? And so arts and sciences. That's what does it consist of? What's the material cause in Aristotle's terminology of classical education? It's the arts and the sciences. Arts, which are roughly translated into skills, mainly the 7 liberal arts, the 3 linguistic skills and the 4 mathematical skills, and then the sciences, which would include not just the natural sciences, which is what people think when you say science. Sciences means an organized body of knowledge, right? And so you had 3 of those. You had the natural sciences, you had the theological sciences, and you had the human sciences, the moral sciences, literature, history, and philosophy. And so if you want a content definition of what classical education is, it's the arts and sciences.
Love that. Well, I'm keeping an eye on our time, so I want to make sure we keep this rolling. Let me ask you a different question. So you were looking at Kentucky roughly 30 years ago, and seemed like there was a lot of not great stuff happening in education. I want to bring this forward to the present. On the one hand, it seems to me that there's pieces that should be very encouraging for anybody in education. School choice seems to be expanding in a lot of states. There have never been more homeschooling families in the United States, at least while we've been calling them homeschooling families, distinct from public school. We've got a greater variety of classical schools starting up, and we've never before had this many support institutions for the classical education movement. I'm curious for you, as somebody who's been kind of participating in this for the last really 3 decades, where do you see classical education today, and where do you see it 10 years from now?
Well, I think that we've been growing and growing and growing, and we've been flying under the radar. But that is no longer the case. There is attention now to this movement in a way that there never has been. When you see Reagan's former Secretary of Education, Bill Bennett, on one of the Sunday news shows, and he says, the really promising thing is this classical education movement. And Forbes magazine starts writing articles about it, and the Wall Street Journal starts writing articles about it. I think we've hit critical mass here. I think that this movement is now, this is in a way a key moment for us, because the attention is now here. How are we going to handle it, right? So I think in terms of the classical education movement, it is growing by leaps and bounds. Every new private school I see opening is a classical school. And so that's very encouraging. At the same time, on school choice, and this is going to, we've gained a lot of ground in the last few years, but this is going to be a hard nut to crack for states like ours in Kentucky, because we just tried to pass because we have one of those Blaine amendments in our Constitution, which disallows school choice. So we have to amend our Constitution. So we put up an amendment on this and lost pretty soundly. Why is that? Because we are a rural state, and other rural states are like this. We're a rural state, so we have 120 counties. So in every one of those counties, there's a county school, and in many times a city school somewhere in whatever the big town is there. And that's the only thing there is there. And in some of those districts, some of those counties, the school system is the primary employer. So if you're a state representative or a state senator from that area, and when I was a lobbyist, I remember hearing this. I'd go into, Senator Smith's office. Joe, SB 136 is going to be on the floor today. You can be there just to, get your troops to the fight. Well, Martin, now, I'm not going to be able to vote yes on that because in my district, the school district is the biggest employer. And they're all opposing it, right? So this is a huge issue for particularly a lot of these rural states. I mean, here we are, as red a state as they come. These are counties that voted for Trump 80-20, but they're voting against school choice. And you have this weird thing where here I'm sitting in Jefferson County, the county that encompasses Louisville, one of the most politically liberal counties in the state. It had a greater percentage of votes for choice in the state, as opposed to all these rural conservative districts that were voting against school choice. People don't think about that, but there's these dynamics in our country that are making this hard.
I think there's something there too that I do think this is a tangent, but I think it's related that pushes back against some of the growth impetuses that are possible for classical ed. Like, I think it's easy to look at moments where you're like, oh, wow, we've got this many states that have now opened the coffers, and to start thinking about scale. But I think that one of the pieces that we're finding, and that I think is behind your story, education is irreducibly local. And education is about a group of families that have gathered together either by choice or by law because of their proximity for the purpose of ensuring that their children are prepared to undertake whatever we decided are the burdens of democracy. And so at that point, so that's really interesting. I had not thought about the rural urban split there, but that pushes to another greater concern about should school districts be the largest employer of a county? Like, that's a whole nother question. I mean, I would say no, but that's a prior question that people would also need to consider in the way we kind of set up our political economy.
Right. I mean, there's going to be a lot of stones that have to be hurled at that Goliath before it falls.
Wow. I think I was talking a couple weeks ago with Robert Pondicio at the American Enterprise Institute about his recent report on the Achilles heel of classical education. It's a fascinating read. He describes he thinks the teacher pipeline issue is the issue that's hindering the classical education's growth potential. And that because it's at this point, we've got all the pieces are in place for entrepreneurs to decide, well, I'm going to launch a school and I can run an organization and I can hire people who can teach in this method, except that you cannot find nearly enough teachers who know this method that you can hire to get to move to wherever you want to open your new school.
Right.
And that seems to be another checkpoint.
That's absolutely true. And I think the biggest problem in schools is the lack of a curriculum, because a curriculum can help with that problem tremendously. But a lot of schools are just putting together their curriculum on the fly, and they get a teacher in, and the teacher, she knows this particular curriculum, so we're going to let her teach that. Well, the next teacher may be different. You need to have a system in a school to train your teachers and train your teachers how to teach it, so that you know that one grade that one grade is building on the previous one and building on that one and building on that one, so that you're actually progressing. And you need teachers, you need material for teachers that they don't have to construct themselves, that has been put together for them by people who know more than they do. That's the only way to do this. And that's the problem I find. We don't have it here at Highlands because we have a set curriculum. We wrote it ourselves. It works well. We're putting out great graduates, and a lot of other people are using it around this country. But that's something that people don't talk about, is the importance of having an actual curriculum. This is what public schools don't have. They don't have a curriculum. Most schools, even private ones, don't have a curriculum.
So the school I started teaching at, Thales Academy, when I started teaching there 10 years ago, or no, 12 years ago now. And at the time, the curriculum was a set of syllabi with course descriptions and book lists. And then each year we would just kind of update the books that we were reading. And I've since come to understand that a lot of schools have what you're describing, and they have sort of a set of resources, and they have teacher guides, and they have assessments. I mean, I could be wrong about this, but I think Memoria Press was one of, if not the oldest, classical education curriculum providers that has those sort of built-out whole grade packages, there's a lot of benefits to that. I think I look at it from the other angle. That I think the other side is and maybe the answer here is probably both, but the other side is teacher formation. I mean, is getting your teachers to the point where actually I don't need a teacher guide for Chaucer. I actually have read Chaucer before. I need to teach it to, say, 9th or 10th graders, and I know what kind of pieces I want to tease out of Chaucer. But if you've never done Chaucer before, Chaucer is really unwieldy to just pick it up and read it with 10th graders. And you're going to hit some landmines if you've never done that before. But
yeah, that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. And, because you can find teachers who do know their stuff, but the majority of teachers don't know, new teachers don't know the subjects they're teaching. And so you have to have something that's going to help them and help them step through it. So in a sense, the curriculum also serves the purpose of teacher training.
Yeah. Well, we'll be sure to put links in the show notes to both the Memoria Press curriculum page, also to Bailey's College's teacher training program, the Certificate in Classical Education Philosophy. It sounds like we both got approaches at trying to tackle that particular Achilles heel. Right. Well, Martin, as we wrap up, what's next in your writing pipeline?
Well, I have collected, or I had somebody collect all my essays from the last 30 years, and it's a large stack. So we're going through them. There'll probably be 4 or 5 books that come out of that. The first one will probably be one called "What is Classical Education," with all my classical education essays over the years.
Oh, I will be very excited to see that. I'll have to get a copy and we'll have to get you back on to talk about that when it comes out. Last question for me: where can people find and follow you online?
You can go to memoriapress.com. That's our website. I do address a lot of education issues on my own social media. I'm mostly on X, just at Martin Cothran. And that's a pretty active account. We have lots of fun debates there. And so those are the 2 best places.
Awesome. Well, Martin, thank you so much for joining me here on The Optimistic Curmudgeon today. This has been really fun.
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me. Good to be with you.
You've been listening to another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. If you enjoyed this episode, like it and share it with your network. Help others think great ideas. You can find the show on all the platforms, but primarily on X as @TheOptimisticC3, on Facebook and LinkedIn under my name, Josh Herring, and on YouTube and Apple Podcasts. Be sure to subscribe to get the next conversation.